On the evening of the 4th of February, America's President Donald Trump stood side by side with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for one of the most astonishing press conferences in all of American history. While speaking, Trump announced to the shock of everybody present that the Gaza Strip's future was going to be neither Palestinian or Israeli. It was going to be American instead. Trump declared that the United States would be taking control over the Gaza Strip in a long-term ownership position, that America would be responsible for dismantling all of the territory's unexploded bombs and other dangerous weapons left over from the past 15 months of war, that America would level all of the buildings in Gaza and get rid of all of the destroyed infrastructure and rubble, and that America would then rebuild the territory into what Trump referred to as the Riviera of the Middle East. A futuristic vision of the territory full of luxury condos and skyrises on prime Mediterranean beachfront property. As for the 2 million plus Palestinian human beings who currently live within Gaza, Trump suggested during the press conference that they would supposedly be temporarily removed from Gaza and relocated to neighboring Arab countries like Jordan and Egypt, while America oversees Gaza's reconstruction. Then, once Gaza was fully rebuilt and transformed into something completely different, Trump declared that people from all over the world would come to live in Gaza, including some of the former Palestinian residents. Now, there's a lot to unpack from this declaration, but since it was made, Trump and his White House staff have both clarified and contradicted many of the plan's key details. For one thing, Trump himself has repeatedly asserted since he made the announcement that he's completely serious about it, adding on to Trump's other declared territorial ambitions for America like Greenland and the Panama Canal. While Trump initially refused to rule out the idea of using American troops themselves to secure Gaza, that has since been significantly walked back by his press secretary and by himself. They now insist that no American troops would be used in securing Gaza at all, and that no American taxpayer dollars would be used to rebuild the territory either. On social media, Trump has since insisted that at the conclusion of the fighting in Gaza, whenever that time comes, Israel would have fully resettled all of the millions of Palestinians away from Gaza elsewhere, and that Israel would then hand over the control and administration of Gaza over to the United States. Whereafter, the US and international partners, like supposedly the oil and cash-rich Arab Gulf states, would work to redevelop Gaza into Trump's vision of the Riviera. Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, hastily assured reporters at the White House the day after Trump's announcement that any Palestinian displacement away from Gaza was only going to be temporary and would not be permanent. But then, just a few days later, during an interview on Fox News, Trump contradicted his own press secretary on this issue by stating that the Palestinians would not, in fact, be allowed to return back to Gaza afterwards, because they would supposedly have, quoted from him directly, much better housing somewhere else and a new permanent place. Now, I'm not going to mince words here. Trump's suggested plan for Gaza is the complete ethnic cleansing of more than 2 million Palestinians from their homes. Trump has insisted that the Palestinians will supposedly want to leave Gaza voluntarily, but there's no practical way that this is even remotely in the realm of possibility. The Palestinians of Gaza will never, under any circumstances, just simply agree to what's essentially another Nakba for them, repeating their ancestors' violent displacement amid the creation of Israel in 1948, that forced many of them into the Gaza Strip to begin with. Any removal of them from Gaza will require brute force, either by Israel or by the United States. The Geneva Conventions are also clear on the criminality of such a plan if it is actually to be seriously considered and carried out. They explicitly forbid mass forcible transfers of population from occupied lands regardless of the motive, while the International Criminal Court explicitly regards forcible population transfers from occupied territory to be a war crime or crimes against humanity. By every definition of international law, Trump's suggested Gaza plan is a blatant war crime at best, and it has revoltingly made the ethnic cleansing of millions an official stated policy of his administration. To only add on to the legal challenges of such a plan, there's also no clear legal mechanism or authority on which the United States could even assume control over the Gaza Strip in the first place. And that's only the beginning of the plan's problems. While Netanyahu and Israelis at large have overwhelmingly approved of Trump's plan since it was announced, it has been almost universally rejected and condemned by not just the Palestinians in the Arab and Muslim worlds, but by pretty much the entire rest of the world beyond America and Israel as well. The plan, even if it's not real and just something that Trump is using as a bluff or a negotiating tactic, is causing irreparable damage to America's historic Arab allies like Jordan and Egypt. It's making any potential peace deal and grand alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia even more difficult than it ever was before. It's unnecessarily exposing America and Americans in general to increased threats of fundamentalist terrorism. It's justifying Hamas and Iran's stated goals of resistance towards Israel and America, and it's greatly endangering the existence of the fragile ceasefire between Hamas and Israel that was agreed upon in January, and which the Trump administration itself had a direct role in helping to bring about in the first place. But regardless of how absurd Trump's proposal for Gaza appears in most respects, there is actually some element of truth behind them. Trump has argued that Gaza is now a hellhole and completely unlivable, and that is why the Palestinians of the territory will supposedly want to leave for a supposedly better life and existence somewhere else. And while he's wrong about the Palestinians wanting to leave, he's right that Gaza itself is currently at an unprecedented level of ruin and destruction. The sheer scale of the destruction that has been wrought upon Gaza over the past 15 months of total war between Israel and Hamas is difficult for anybody outside of Gaza to truly understand and comprehend. According to an analysis of Copernicus Sentinel-1 satellite data that was published by Reuters, more than 60% of all the buildings present in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged by the war's fighting, with an even heavier scale of overall damage reported in the previously more densely populated northern areas of the Strip centered around Gaza City. Up here, 74% of the buildings within Gaza City, which was previously home to more than 500,000 people, have been damaged or destroyed, while 70% of the buildings in North Gaza have been damaged or destroyed as well. To give a sense of the overwhelming scale of destruction, a damage assessment by the United Nations Satellite Center found that nearly 164,000 buildings in the Gaza Strip were damaged or destroyed by the war as of September 2024. Almost 3 times as many buildings as exist on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Included within those damaged or destroyed buildings, many of which are high-rise apartments home to multiple units, are more than 227,000 lost housing units in Gaza, which have left most of the territory's Palestinian population homeless. A recent study by a nonprofit called Oxfam has concluded that more than 1.6 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are currently homeless in total, and living in rudimentary makeshift shelters, comprising the vast majority of the territory's pre-war population. It's been further estimated by the United Nations that all of these destroyed and damaged buildings in the Gaza Strip have left behind a massive pile of rubble equivalent to about 42 million tons worth of debris, an enormous 14 times more debris than was previously left behind in Gaza by every other war they fought with Israel going all the way back to 2008. Just in order to remove all of this rubble from the territory, even under the best-case scenarios of constant peace and large amounts of modern construction equipment, would take 14 years in order to accomplish, according to a UN report that was published in April of 2024. And in order to fully remove all of the debris and to completely rebuild Gaza back up into its pre-war state, would take at least a whopping $80 billion by now, also according to the UN, leaving behind this massive bill for anyone to consider who wants to see Gaza rebuilt. And assuming the worst-case scenario of Gaza remaining under a near total blockade by Israel, the UN estimated that it would take an astonishing 350 years in order to adequately rebuild Gaza back to its pre-war levels of economic activity. Something else that greatly complicates the future of life and any future considerations on how to rebuild Gaza are the unknown but almost certainly massive numbers of unexploded bombs, grenades, artillery shells, and other munitions that now litter the Gaza Strip. Only 200 days into Israel's bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip in April of 2024, Foreign Affairs reported that the Israeli Air Force had already dropped more than 70,000 tons of bombs across the territory, which surpassed the tonnage of bombs dropped at Dresden, Hamburg, and London during the Second World War all combined. Many of these Israeli bombs, just like many of the bombs dropped during the Second World War, failed to explode when they impacted their targets and now lie scattered around Gaza still live and waiting to be triggered. Simon Elmont, an explosives expert for a nonprofit called Humanity and Inclusion, recently reported to the Washington Post that there are likely tens of thousands of pieces of unexploded ordnance left behind across the Gaza Strip right now, and that it would likely take somewhere between 25 and 30 years just to clear most of all of that out. All of this poses not only a massive hurdle to any reconstruction effort, but to the continued life and safety of the Palestinians who remain in Gaza too. Luke Irving, a UN bomb disposal expert who's based in Gaza, also told reporters recently that just since the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas entered into force on the 19th of January, 24 Palestinians have already succumbed to unexploded ordnance in the territory. Gaza's most critical infrastructure is overwhelmingly in ruins and littered with these kinds of unexploded bombs. The territory's hospitals and clinics, its water treatment facilities, and its universities, not to mention its mosques and churches, are all overwhelmingly destroyed and reduced to the statistics of rubble that now need to be cleared. It's also been estimated that the war has destroyed around 70% of Gaza's already limited agricultural land. And none of this is to even mention the enormous amounts of toxic dust that have been released from the destroyed and damaged buildings in the Strip that are resulting in hazardous chemicals and materials seeping into Gaza's remaining water supply and being breathed into the lungs of Gaza's remaining population. Most of the buildings in the Gaza Strip are of older construction origin back when asbestos was a more commonly used material, before it was well understood to be extremely toxic. After the war destroyed most of these asbestos-laden buildings in the Strip, the UN has reported that around 800,000 tons of the total debris present in Gaza are likely contaminated with asbestos, and will now be required to be handled specially as hazardous waste. Winds sweeping across Gaza will blow asbestos-laden dust across the Strip, while asbestos-laden rainfall will spread the toxins even further into Gaza's groundwater and surrounding coastal waters, exposing most, if not all, of Gaza's remaining surviving population to critical asbestos exposure that will introduce significant long-term health effects like lung cancer. This is all why many analysts argue that the Gaza Strip has already been made uninhabitable by the war between Israel and Hamas, and why numerous humanitarian organizations and countries from all around the world have already concluded that Israel's war on Gaza has been genocidal in nature. It's not only the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been killed during the war, but the overwhelming destruction dealt to Gaza itself that will make any continued life and existence there for all of the survivors incredibly challenging, if not outright impossible. This is also why the Trump administration is advocating for removing the Palestinians from Gaza while the territory is rebuilt, because attempting to rebuild the small and crowded territory while there are still around 2 million people living there will inevitably make the process that much more challenging. But in many ways, the current situation with Gaza in 2025 is similar to that of Tokyo in Japan 80 years ago back in 1945 at the very end of World War II. Back then, most of Tokyo had been left in ruins by massive Allied firebombing attacks on the city during Operation Meeting House. 41 square kilometers of central Tokyo were completely annihilated during those bombings that killed around 100,000 people and left more than 1 million others homeless. Numbers that are fairly comparable to Israel's bombings of Gaza today. After the war, though, Tokyo managed to be fully rebuilt within only a decade by the mid-1950s, while no mass displacement of Tokyo's 1 million homeless residents was carried out through the reconstruction process either. The main differences between Tokyo then compared to Gaza now, however, are twofold. For one, there was a certainty that the war between Japan and the Allies had ended for good, with Imperial Japan's unconditional surrender, which gave confidence to those investing in rebuilding the city that another war wouldn't just immediately destroy them again. This criteria is currently lacking in Gaza today, where Hamas is still in power and still unwilling to surrender. While the second factor in Tokyo's quick reconstruction was that America's occupation strategy of Japan at the time was to actually assist the local population with rebuilding and returning back to their homes again, a policy that the current Trump administration is currently completely rejecting in Gaza. To complicate matters even further regarding Gaza's future has been the dramatic hardening in opinions between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians since the October 7, 2023 attack and the war that has followed. Back in 2012, only 13 years ago, the polling agency Gallup found that the majority of the Israeli public supported a two-state solution to end the Israel-Palestine conflict, with 61% of Israelis at the time reporting that they supported the two-state solution and only 30% saying that they rejected it. Today, the popularity of these opinions have practically switched within mainstream Israeli society. In October of 2024, 1 year after the October 7th attacks, another Gallup poll in Israel found that today, only 27% of Israelis continue supporting the two-state solution as an end to the conflict, while a significant 64% of Israelis now oppose it. While the differences in opinion between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs was even more striking. The same October 2024 poll found that only 17% of Israeli Jews now support the creation of an independent Palestinian state, while an overwhelming 75% of Israeli Arabs supported the creation of one at the same time, showing an emerging clear split on this issue between Israel's own Jewish majority and Arab minority populations. Attitudes have also recently shifted sharply against a peaceful solution to the conflict in the occupied Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank as well. Before the current war in Gaza, most research showed that a significant majority of the Palestinians in Gaza supported the two-state solution, based on the pre-1967 borders of Palestine being based on Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, while only about 20% of Gazans supported a military solution to ending the conflict that would result in Israel's destruction. However, a recent study conducted by Foreign Affairs in Gaza in January of 2025 concluded that now, after the war and the annihilation of Gaza, the Gazan population is almost evenly split between these two opinions, with only 48% still preferring the two-state solution and 47% supporting continued warfare resulting in the destruction of Israel. But even this difference in opinion hides just how much more opposed to the status quo Gazans have become recently. Because, out of that 48% of the population who still support a two-state solution, only 20% of them supported the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders, while the other 28% of them advocated for either a return back to the 1947 UN partition plan borders, or Israel granting the Palestinians the right of return, enabling all of the descendants of Palestinians who were forced from their homes in the Nakba after 1948 to freely return back to their ancestral homes in Israel again. And to be fair, despite the majority of Israelis and Palestinians having supported the two-state solution back in 2012, the government of Israel, especially under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was consistently making that practically impossible. The population of Israeli Jewish settlers present in the occupied West Bank has roughly quintupled since 1993, from only around 112,000 back then to more than 517,000 today, increasing the Israeli Jewish demographic hold over a territory that has long been considered to be the core of any future independent Palestinian state, and making it significantly harder for Israel to simply give it up, since doing so now would require the evacuations of more than 500,000 Jewish settlers there back into Israel proper. The West Bank is, of course, of enormous geostrategic importance to Israel, so much so that it will almost certainly never give it all up voluntarily. This is because the West Bank forms a highly elevated mountain ridge that runs north to south that directly overlooks the densely populated Israeli coastal plain that's home to Tel Aviv and 70% of the entire Israeli population, including all of the country's most valuable tech companies and industry and the major international airport. The distance from the West Bank to downtown Tel Aviv is only about 16 kilometers at its narrowest point, meaning that if any hostile power was in control of the West Bank, they could utilize the high ground to bombard Israel's narrow core on the coastal plain, and they could easily advance at the narrowest point to sever Israel into two separate halves. Control over the West Bank is, geographically speaking, crucial for anybody who wants to either defend or to harm Israel. And so, ever since 1967, Israel has calculated that the damage done to their international reputation by continuing to occupy the West Bank is better than giving up their control over it to an uncertain future. And those attitudes have only hardened within Israel's Jewish population following Hamas's October 7th attack. From the Israeli perspective now, if Hamas was able to do as much damage to Israel as it did from Gaza, a hostile force in control of the West Bank, merely 16 kilometers away from Israel's biggest city, would be capable of causing even more damage. Trump himself has argued that his idea to solve the Gaza-Israel problem is different from what has been attempted for decades with no solutions. But he's really just advocating for the final culmination of American and Israeli policy towards Gaza and the Palestinians that's already existed for decades. In theory, America's foreign policy towards both Israel and Palestine for decades was based on Washington's publicly declared support for a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders of Israel, but their simultaneous, complete, and uncritical support for Israel and Israeli policies on the ground that consistently made the two-state solution impossible to ever really implement. Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank continued growing, which America recognized as being illegal under international law, but also never attempted to stop or punish by withholding aid or by applying sanctions. No peace agreement or two-state solution could ever be agreed upon between the Israelis and the Palestinians, despite multiple American presidents directly trying to mediate one. The US never officially accepted Israel's annexations of occupied territories like East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, but again, it also never really did very much to stop Israel from annexing those territories either, because the rush of American money to Israel was never interrupted. Israel is, of course, by far the largest recipient of American foreign aid in history. Since Israel's founding in 1948, the United States has showered Israel with about $310 billion in foreign aid in inflation-adjusted dollars, and consistently provides $3.8 billion a year to the Israeli military. America was always very unapologetically pro-Israel, so even though when Donald Trump first became president in 2017, he was widely called the most pro-Israeli president in history, he really only began extending official American recognition to Israel's policies of occupation that had always been quietly and unofficially supported anyway. Nonetheless, during his first term in office between 2017 and 2021, Trump provided the Israelis with many diplomatic gifts that undid decades of previous official American foreign policy towards the conflict. Trump chose to relocate the American embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and in doing so, he effectively recognized all of Jerusalem as the exclusive capital of Israel, and extended American recognition of Israel's 1980 annexation of East Jerusalem, which had long been envisioned as one day becoming the capital of an independent Palestinian state. That decision effectively ended any possibility of American support for East Jerusalem ever becoming Palestinian, and it was far from Trump's only gift. Trump also extended America's recognition of Israel's 1981 annexation of the Golan Heights they occupied from Syria, while the first Trump administration also stated that they didn't view the hundreds of thousands of Jewish Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank as being in any violation of international law. In early 2020, the Trump administration also revealed another peace plan proposal for a two-state solution that virtually everybody considered was very pro-Israeli. The plan retained East Jerusalem as Israeli territory and rejected it as Palestine's capital. Israel was going to be allowed to annex roughly 30% of the West Bank's land, including all of their major settlements and the entire Jordan Valley along the border with Jordan, while the Palestinian state would have been given some much less valuable land in exchange in the Negev desert connected to Gaza. The plan would not have left the Palestinian state behind as a viable, functioning state. The West Bank part of the state would be sliced up between sovereign Israeli settlements and roads, while it would also be completely landlocked, surrounded by Israeli territory on all sides with no access to any fresh water out of the Jordan River. It would have bridges connecting it to the country of Jordan over Israeli territory and a tunnel between the West Bank and Gaza sides beneath Israeli territory. But they would also have to agree to complete demilitarization and effectively put themselves at Israel's complete mercy. The plan was rejected by the Palestinians, but it was also rejected by the Israeli Jewish Settlers Council in the West Bank, simply because it envisioned any independent Palestinian state at all. The Trump administration never ended up signing off on the Israeli annexations in the West Bank, and after the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and Trump lost the next election a few months after he proposed the deal, it died a quiet death and was never implemented. Trump spent the last several months of his first administration pursuing the Abraham Accords. His idea to basically start using the threat of Israel's looming annexations in the West Bank to start convincing various Arab states to normalize their relations with Israel in order to stop it. Using that and various other methods, Trump was able to convince the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan to all recognize Israel and normalize their relations, while he aggressively pursued the ultimate prize next, convincing Saudi Arabia to become the next one to do it, and forming what would be a powerful Israel-Saudi grand alliance in the Middle East as a bulwark against their shared rival, Iran and its proxies. After Biden assumed the presidency, he did very little to reverse any of Trump's policies towards Israel, and he took over directly where Trump left off at expanding the Abraham Accords to try and include Saudi Arabia's recognition of Israel, which culminated with Hamas's attack on Israel that was launched on October 7, 2023, that largely attempted to crush that deal from being made. The Biden administration then almost unconditionally supported Israel's retaliatory war on Hamas in Gaza that led to the Gaza Strip's current state of annihilation. The Biden administration applied very few constraints on Israel's war on Gaza. They eventually restricted the transfer of heavy 2,000-pound bombs to Israel out of concern for Israel's usage of the bombs in small and densely populated areas. And they applied a handful of sanctions on some Israeli settlers in the West Bank, accused of committing violence against Palestinians there. At the same time, the Biden administration authorized nearly $18 billion of direct military aid to Israel in the period between the October 7th attack in 2023 and November of 2024, which directly contributed to Gaza's present state of ruin and the current question of what to do about that next. There were already clues that Trump's second administration is going to be even more pro-Israeli than his first administration was. And specifically, his second administration will be much more welcoming of the Israeli religious far right. These clues can be seen in many of Trump's political appointments for key diplomatic positions. For the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Trump has selected the former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, to fill the role, a very outspoken Christian Zionist who's always been publicly opposed to the two-state solution, who suggested during his own run for the presidency in 2015 that he would recognize Israel's annexation of the West Bank, and who as recently as 2024 said during a podcast interview that he didn't believe there was such a thing as the Palestinian people. For his pick of defense secretary, Trump has chosen Pete Hegseth, who as recently as 2018 delivered a speech in Jerusalem that advocated for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, and for its replacement with a third Jewish temple. And for his pick for the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Trump has selected Elise Stefanik, who during her confirmation hearing at the U.S. Senate refused to say whether or not the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, while she further said that she believes that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. On top of this, Trump also immediately reversed the few guardrails that the Biden administration had imposed on Israel to begin with. He reopened the transfer of the heavy 2,000-pound bombs to Israel again, and revoked the sanctions that had been imposed on the handful of Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank.
Hamas.
Representative Stefanik, it was a very simple question. I just asking you if you agree with the statement that in order to achieve long-term peace and stability in the Middle East, that we have to secure the human rights and rights of self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians. That's a yes or no?
I support human rights for all, and I think it's a disgrace that Hamas and Hezbollah have stripped human rights of the Palestinian people, and we need to ensure that we are standing up for human rights, and Israel is standing up for human rights. It is a beacon of human rights in the region.
We agree with that. I asked you in my office also about whether Palestinians have the right of self-determination. My understanding was you said yes. Do you have a different answer today?
That was not the direct question that we discussed. I said the Palestinian people...
You believe that Palestinians have the right of self-determination?
I believe the Palestinian people deserve so much better than the failures that they've had from terrorist leadership.
It's just a pretty simple question.
And I believe we need peace in the region. Of course they deserve human rights.
So...
I want to ensure that, number one, we bring the hostages home.
So do all of us. Representative Stefanik, let me just ask you. I have 30 seconds left. I'm rarely surprised by answers in my office, but I did ask you whether you subscribe to the views of Finance Minister Smotrich.
Of who? I'm sorry,
Smotrich. This is the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich and the former National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who believe that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. And in that conversation, you told me that, yes, you shared that view. Is that your view today?
Yes.
All of this, and Trump's own legacy of accommodating policies towards Israel during his first term, led to ecstatic elation among the Israeli far right after his election that during his second administration, Trump may begin again where he left off with his proposed peace plan in 2020 that will see him finally extending America's recognition of Israel's annexations of parts or all of the occupied West Bank. And this brings us back up to Trump's shocking announcement in February that the United States will be taking over and administrating the Gaza Strip after it's presumably emptied out of all of its remaining Palestinian residents by Israel. The plan has since, perhaps unsurprisingly, received fairly widespread support within Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly praised Trump's Gaza plan since it was announced alongside him, and he has said that his government in Israel is fully prepared to carry it out. Even several of Netanyahu's most significant political opponents within Israel have also praised the plan as well, including the country's former defense minister Benny Gantz and the current leader of the opposition in Israel, Yair Lapid. The day after Trump announced his Gaza plan, the National Post reported on a poll conducted in Israel which concluded that 52% of Israeli Jews supported the proposal, while only 8% of Israeli Arabs supported it. Again, showing a clear divide emerging within Israeli society on the Palestinian issue between the country's Jewish and Arab populations. And while Trump's Gaza plan has been largely welcomed by Israel, it's been resoundingly rejected by just about everybody else in the world, especially by Israel's neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. Since Trump's plan for Gaza calls for the resettlement of around 2 million Palestinians in Gaza somewhere else that's also not Israel, the only realistic places for them to go would be across the southern border into Egypt or nearby into Jordan, which for a multitude of reasons would be completely unacceptable to both nations. For one thing, there's a significant and understandable fear in both nations and in the greater Arab world at large that accepting the liquidation of Palestinians from Gaza to do the same thing to the 3 million Palestinians who live in the occupied West Bank next, potentially forcing all of them into Jordan next and destroying the decades-long Palestinian cause for nationhood once and for all. From Egypt's perspective, the entire population of the Sinai Peninsula is only around 600,000 people, meaning that if even half of Gaza's population was transferred across the border into the Sinai, it would demographically become a majority Palestinian territory. Barred from being able to return back to Gaza and forced off from their land, how likely do you think it would be that the displaced Palestinians in the Sinai would continue the fight and continue launching attacks against Israel only from Egyptian territory? I think it would be very likely, which would introduce a major new security threat for Egypt to have to deal with. A militant Palestinian insurgency developing across the Sinai would almost be a certainty that Egypt would struggle to pacify, while the presence of militant Palestinian groups operating in the Sinai would stand to eventually bring Egypt and Israel directly into conflict. It's not hard to imagine, based on Israel's previous invasions into Lebanon to stamp out displaced militant Palestinians there who were still attacking Israel, that they would also consider future invasions of the Sinai to stamp out displaced militant Palestinians there who are attacking Israel as well. Egypt is also currently a state with enormous financial and demographic problems to contend with. The country has been consumed for years by the worst financial crisis it has faced in decades, that has led to the Egyptian currency being devalued on 4 separate occasions just since 2022, with the most recent devaluation in 2024 resulting in Egypt's currency losing about 60% of its value against the US dollar. Inflation skyrocketed in Egypt and still remains high at an annualized rate of 24% as of December 2024, while the country's debt-to-GDP ratio still remains high as well at 89%. Egypt's total national debt is also forecast to continually increase through the end of the decade as well, and will probably reach more than $400 billion by 2029, and a significant amount of that debt is owed to the United States. Moreover, there's an even bigger war than the one in Gaza happening right now across Egypt's other border to the south in Sudan, a war that's already resulted in more than 1.2 million Sudanese refugees fleeing from their country to Egypt since 2023. That's already added an enormous amount of societal pressure on the Egyptian government. The threat of millions of additional Palestinian refugees being pushed into Egypt from Gaza stands to potentially become the final feather that overwhelms Egypt. It would spark fury amongst Egypt's very pro-Palestinian public after years of mounting anger rising over the country's chronic economic crisis that could lead to another revolution developing in the country that would have unpredictable results. Because of these reasons, Egypt's leader, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has threatened that Trump's Gaza plan going forward would violate Egypt's 1979 peace treaty with Israel, which could lead to a resumption in war between the two states that's remained dormant for decades now. And the concerns that Egypt has over the plan are only amplified in Jordan. Jordan received significant waves of Palestinian refugees following the events of 1948, and they granted them full citizenship, unlike in most other Arab countries where they and their descendants are still treated as perennial refugees and outsiders to this very day. Subsequent waves of Palestinian refugees to Jordan following more wars with Israel have resulted in a situation where a very significant amount of Jordan's population are already Palestinian in origin. Out of the 11 million people who live in Jordan today, 2.4 million of them are already registered as Palestinian refugees, or roughly 1 in 5 of the people who live there. Since Jordan doesn't collect official census data for how many of their total inhabitants are actually Palestinian, it's unclear how many people in total in the country are Palestinian, because the registered refugees in Jordan don't account for the Palestinians and their descendants who were granted Jordanian citizenship after the 1948 war. This is why there are some estimates out there that believe in reality, a majority of Jordan's population are already probably of Palestinian origin. On top of that, Jordan is also regarded by the UN as the second most water-stressed country in the entire world. Most of Jordan's land is an uninhabitable desert, and its 11 million people overwhelmingly live within the few areas where it actually rains just across the border from Israel and following the Jordan River. The UN defines severe water scarcity as amounting to 500 cubic meters of renewable freshwater resources per person in a country. In Jordan, that ratio is already a fifth of that, at just 100 cubic meters of renewable freshwater resources per person. So, if you relocate millions of additional Palestinians into Jordan, it would almost certainly tip the demographic balance in the country into being majority Palestinian. And it would almost certainly overwhelm the country's already catastrophically strained water resources to the literal breaking point. To say nothing of the potential next forced exodus of millions more Palestinians from the occupied West Bank into Jordan. Accepting Gaza's liquidation and large numbers of additional Palestinian refugees from there would most likely end up resulting in the state collapse of Jordan and the overthrowing of the country's monarchy that has ruled the country for more than a century now. And this would be disastrous to American interests in the Middle East, because Jordan has historically been a bastion of stability in the central Middle East that borders chronically unstable countries like Syria and Iraq. Jordan hosts multiple US military bases that grant rapid access to targets in Syria and Iraq, while the Jordanian military collaborates with the United States on intelligence and even in defending Israel, as they did in April of 2024 when they helped out with directly shooting down Iranian missiles that were flying over their airspace on their way to Israel. Trump's plan for Gaza, if carried out, will lead to a cascading series of chaotic consequences elsewhere that could lead to state collapses in both Egypt and in Jordan alike. And there's no telling what unpredictable Pandora's box of consequences those developments could unleash in the Middle East next. The leaders of both countries then, understandably, have firmly rejected Trump's Gaza plan since they recognize how massively destabilizing it would be for them. But that hasn't seemed to have stopped Trump from insisting that he'll still be able to change their minds anyway. Trump has threatened that if Egypt and Jordan refuse to take in the Gazan population, he could decide on withholding the huge amounts of foreign aid that the US has provided to both for decades. The US provides Egypt with $1.4 billion a year in direct military aid, while it provides Jordan with $1.72 billion a year in overall aid. Numbers that were established after Egypt made peace with Israel in 1979 and after Jordan made peace with Israel in 1994. The US has provided tens of billions of dollars to both countries as a way to essentially bribe or reward them for maintaining their peace with Israel. And especially in Jordan's case, the billions of dollars of US aid has helped them tremendously with operating their government and military budgets. If Trump enforced cuts or even eliminations of that aid to them, it would be very destructive to both and would be particularly destructive to Jordan, who relies on the American aid much more than Egypt does. But despite that economic damage from refusing Trump's plan, both countries would almost certainly calculate that the damage of accepting the plan would be far worse. Which is why Jordan has gone so far as to threaten that if the plan is actually carried out, it would violate their country's 1994 peace treaty with Israel, and it would directly lead to a resumption of war between them, as the Jordanian army would be deployed to forcibly reject any attempted Palestinian population transfer from the West Bank or Gaza. Even though Jordan knows that it would inevitably lose a war with Israel, they would be pressed into not having much else of a choice. It would either be war or accepting the inevitable collapse of their country. And when you're presented with an inevitable outcome like that, the uncertainty of choosing a war would appear to anyone as being more appealing. In order to avoid choosing between two impossible options, between accepting the liquidation of Gaza and the strains placed on their states or losing their American financial support and the strains placed on their states, Egypt and Jordan could, and probably would, attempt to take a third option and distance themselves away from the US towards other sources of alternative funding and support, like the Gulf states or potentially China, leading to America ceding influence over critical Middle Eastern states like Egypt with the all-important Suez Canal, and sparking a new generation of conflict between Egypt and Jordan against Israel in the process, undoing decades of previous progress towards peace between them. But even this decision would not be without pain for Egypt and Jordan. Both of their militaries are composed almost entirely of American-produced equipment built up over the past several decades that requires American-made spare parts and expertise to continue operating. If they end their relationship with the Americans, it would leave their militaries without those spare parts to keep everything going. And if they began purchasing new military equipment from China or Russia, it would take years worth of time to fully retrain and recalibrate their militaries to them, while the new equipment would be incompatible with their older stockpiles of American equipment. The Egyptian and Jordanian militaries would be severely weakened for a number of years as a result, with again, unpredictable consequences. Trump's plan for Gaza, disregarding all of the numerous ethical and legal concerns, will probably also lead to a cascading series of terrible consequences. These consequences include potential state collapse scenarios in both Jordan and Egypt, a resumption of hostilities between Jordan, Egypt, and Israel, the elimination of America's military bases in Jordan, the creation of an unpredictable maw of chaos in both Jordan and in the Sinai, directly across the borders from Saudi Arabia's $500 billion NEOM development project, restricted access to the US Navy through the Suez Canal, the elimination of any chance of an alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia from ever happening, the complete vindication of Iran's argument of resistance against Israel and America, and the likely resurgence of Iran's ability to establish anti-Israeli and anti-American proxy forces, and the establishment of both Israel and the United States as global pariah states on the scale of Russia or North Korea. To say nothing of the inevitable increase in anti-American and anti-Israeli terrorism around the world that such a decision would inspire, none of which are within America's best geopolitical interests. Some people have suggested that Trump's Gaza plan is all bluster and is just being used to gain negotiating leverage with Hamas on finally ending the war once and for all. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but even if that's true, it's still been an extremely reckless and damaging series of statements to have made that have already caused irreparable damage to America's soft power and prestige, and to America's relationships with allies like Egypt, Jordan, and the broader Arab and Muslim worlds, while they've also emboldened the political far-right extremes in Israel to further advance their control over both Gaza and the West Bank, making it all the harder for America to ever convince Israel and Saudi Arabia to cooperate together against Iran, since Saudi Arabia is now firmly conditioning the creation of an independent Palestinian state in exchange for normalizing their relations with Israel. Trump's suggestion for the Gaza Strip's future has provoked horror, and it has also provoked action, perhaps as intended, among the Arab states to gather together and offer a counterproposal. Saudi Arabia is currently spearheading an Arab counterproposal to Trump's plan, which, as of this video's production, might include things like Saudi and other Gulf state funding for Gaza's reconstruction, and a potential Arab peacekeeping force that could be deployed to Gaza that would sideline Hamas. But right now, it's unclear what exactly the Arab counterproposal would be, and whether or not Israel and Trump would actually accept or reject it. The future of both Gaza and the West Bank are both deeply uncertain right now with a lot of variables. But one thing is for certain. Israel's total war waged on Hamas in Gaza, Trump's suggestion to establish American control over Gaza, and Netanyahu's own suggestions to begin annexing parts or all of the occupied West Bank have done little to quell the spirit of resistance within the Palestinians who live in those territories. And if anything, they've significantly hardened them. After more than 15 months of war in Gaza, despite Israel having accomplished most of their military objectives, including the eliminations of virtually all of Hamas's senior leadership, Netanyahu's government has still never actually presented a concrete political strategy for what comes the day after the war in Gaza ends that will not radicalize the Palestinians into seeking even more revenge. Trump's proposal for Gaza has, to many Palestinians and Arabs, confirmed America's complicity in a decades-long Israeli project to eliminate the chance of an independent Palestinian state from ever being possible. The war that destroyed Gaza, Trump's plan for their future, and Israel's open acceptance of the plan has reinforced a generationally deep-seated fear among the Palestinians in Gaza that their very identities and existence are currently under enormous threat, potentially more than at any other point in their already deeply troubled modern history. And that feeling among them right now is not too dissimilar from the feeling among the Jews that originally led to the creation of Israel, and which inspired their people for generations to continue fighting on for their right to exist and to survive. The war between Israel and Hamas and Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip since the October 7th attack of 2023 has been among the most shocking and destructive conflicts of the entire 21st century. It has thrust the relationship between America and Israel into the forefront of American political discourse. It has sparked deep questions within Israel about what the country stands for, and it has imperiled a generation of Palestinians with dread and uncertainty about what their place in the future will even be. It has led to furious debate as to whether or not Israel's actions in Gaza constitute the crime of genocide. And if so, how deeply does America's complicity in perpetuating it run? In this video's next part, I'm going to explain in detail the course of events in Israel's invasion of Gaza, running from the day after the October 7th attacks to 1 year later in October of 2024, and along the way, I will provide the arguments both for and against Israel waging a campaign of genocide in Gaza, within the overall context of events that have taken place between themselves and Hamas. But of course, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and very recent nature of discussing what is quite possibly the most controversial conflict of the whole 21st century, a series of events that involve the deaths of tens of thousands of people, genocide, and other unspeakable war crimes and atrocities, would inevitably cause the rest of the video that came before it to become demonetized and age-restricted if it hasn't already been just by discussing hypothetical future events. Which ultimately would mean the YouTube's algorithm would have never promoted any of this video to you, and you probably never would have seen any of it. But thankfully, I was still able to produce the next part of this video anyway because of the power of this video's sponsor, Nebula, where you can go and watch the next 40-minute part covering exactly how Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip transpired over the course of a year between late 2023 and late 2024, and why so many of the events that happened have led to multiple humanitarian organizations and countries from around the world to label the invasion as genocidal in nature. And this is also just one of more than several dozen exclusive full-length real-life lore videos that you can only find on Nebula in my overall Modern Conflict series there, which can all only be found over there because of all of their darker, more controversial subject material. That means that there's a bunch of other previous episodes you can also go and watch right now that were very relevant to this video too. Like this episode that covers the hour-by-hour events that transpired during Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. This episode covering all of the previous wars and conflicts fought between Israel and Hamas that led up to the current war. This episode covering the Lebanese civil war and the birth of Hezbollah to Israel's north. Or this episode covering the recent toppling of the Assad regime in Syria. All of which will help to give you an incredible amount of context into what's currently going on around Gaza in Israel today and why. And what's even more, you also get access to all of the other amazing exclusive content that's available on Nebula, because the best part about this site is that it's jointly co-owned by all of its creators, built by myself and hundreds of other independent YouTubers and podcasters. And because it's a subscription-based service, we all get to work on way bigger and higher budget productions over there than we could ever afford to do on our own on YouTube. That's why there's tons of other exclusive content that you'll find equally fascinating from all of these other creators over there you probably also already know as well. And best of all, if you sign up by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link that's down below in the description, you'll receive an insane 40% discount off of an annual subscription, which means it'll only cost you $3 a month or $36 a year for all of this awesome exclusive content from myself and hundreds of other independent creators, with even more stuff getting added every single month. And if you already have a Nebula subscription and you want to gift one to a friend or a loved one, you can now do that as well with a gifted subscription with the exact same discount by following the link down in the description as well. This is the absolute best way to help support what I'm doing here on Real Life Lore. And as always, thank you so much for watching.